back to Model Train Outsider, Episode 2. In this episode, I would like to talk about what?
What am I? Chopped liver?
No, you're a really bad jump edit trying to make something kind of funny here, which probably is stupid to begin with.
I thought I was an existential projection of your interior ego and id in conflict with your current situation because you haven't been able to deal with the emotional crises of having gotten into model trains so late in life and trying to catch up and learn everything you should have learned when you were a kid and first started playing with trains.
No, we are not getting into this whole Freudian debate of ego, id, superego. You are just me, filmed later, filling in jump cuts to make this look like I'm talking to myself.
It sucks when you can't handle reality.
Anyhow, what I'd like to talk about in this episode, 2 key terms if you're going to get into model training. Size and scale, and era. These are 2 things to consider when you're getting into model training. First thing I'd like to talk about is size and scale. In model trains, you will hear the words size, scale, and gauge. And sometimes they even get used mistakenly or as if they're interchangeably. And technically they're not. Size is the name. H-O. The largest is G, and they go through from G to 1 to O to H-O to T-T, which is tabletop, to N, down to the smallest model trains you can get, Z scale. Now, occasionally you'll hear somebody misquote and say H-O gauge, or that's wrong. So the first thing you have is the name. Now, what is the difference? Well, the difference is the scale. That's vocab word number 2 today, scale. The scale is simply the ratio of the model to the actual train. And each of these sizes has a different scale. For example, G, the largest, which comes from German gross, is 1 to 22.5. In other words, a G-scale model train is 1/22nd and a half the size of an actual train. So, on the side here, you will see the sizes coming up. We have G-scale, as mentioned, is 1 to 22.5. Those are the biggest. Very popular for people to do outside trains. Some of those really cheap model trains you see in stores for Christmas time are basically G-scale trains. 1 scale is 1 to 32. It's a ratio of 1 to 32. It's 1/32nd the size of an actual train. O scale is 1 to 45. It's 1/45th the size of the actual train. HO, my scale, is 1 to 87. It's 1/87th the size. Tabletop is 1 to 120. N is 1 to 160. And Z scale is 1 to 220. Now, different countries have different scales. There's A scales and F scales, and in Japan, N scale is very, very popular. Now, one scale I haven't mentioned yet is double O scale. You will see that sometimes. Double O scale is primarily a United Kingdom scale. England, Scotland, Ireland. It is really focused on those islands. It is roughly the size of HO scale, a little bit bigger. It's 1 to 76. So, the other number you hear, or word you hear associated with model trains, is gauge. Now, gauge is actually the size the space between the rails that you're modeling. For example, here is a piece of Märklin C-track. Okay, I'll have to explain those later as well. The distance between the two rails, this distance here, is called the gauge. And basically, each model train size has a different gauge. Not 100% true. But basically, this is the gauge. Now, when people say HO gauge, they're technically incorrect because HO can have 3 gauges. But there's a basic gauge, and then there's what they call narrow gauge, and there's 2 different sizes of narrow gauge. But again, we're not here to cloud you. I'm trying to simplify. All right, so the size, the scale of a model train is simply the ratio of its size to the actual thing. And then when you hear the word gauge, it's actually the space between the 2 rails. Each track has a different gauge. So if you look here, here are the gauges. G and 1 scale basically have the same gauge, 45 millimeters between the tracks, between the rails. O scale is 32 millimeters. It gets narrower. HO scale, my scale, is 16 and a half. But there are called narrow gauges, which are 12 millimeter or 9 millimeter. But that's for people that are modeling very specific times and very specific types. For example, the mountains in Switzerland and Austria often use narrow gauge trains because they couldn't get a wide enough path for full gauge to get in, so they narrowed it up. Double O, the British, the UK's popular size, also uses HO scale track. It uses the gauge of 16 and a half millimeters. So double O model trains will run on HO track. Anyhow, tabletop is 12 millimeters, N scale is 9 millimeters, and Z scale is only 6.5 millimeters between the rails. So that's it. Size is the name, HO, double O, NZ, what have you. Scale is the ratio of the model to the actual thing. And gauge is the distance between the rails on the track. So, why are there so many scales? It's based on how much space do you have, and that's a decision you need to think about. One of the first things you should do when you are considering getting into model trains is think about how much space do you have? Where are you going to fit this? If you have a small room, you might want to get a smaller scale. You might want to go tabletop or N or Z. If you've got a lot of space or you've got a big yard and you want to really show it off, then you're going to go with the larger scales. Now, there are pros and cons with each. For example, the larger scales, they're bigger, they're going to look more realistic. The paint jobs, the parts, all the accessories are going to look much more like their real counterpart. Because they're bigger, there's more room to add all the little details. And they're beautiful, but you're also going to pay more money. The smaller scales, HO is the most popular scale. Probably 70% of all model train people do HO scale. It's the one place where I'm really not an outsider because I did pick the most popular size of trains to get into. But you got a small space, you go N scale or Z scale. However, when you go N scale and Z scale, you're not going to get quite as detailed, although the technology today with all the different ways they can produce the laser cutting, the 3D graphic rotoscoping, and that the Z scale trains today and even the N scales are quite elaborate and very pretty. However, going down in size, you lose a little bit in function. Not only are they not quite as detailed, it's hard to get all those little details into it, but also they're just no room to put in some of the bells and whistles that you can put into the bigger trains. I'm a bells and whistles guy. I want all the sounds and the functions, the lights, and as much as they can pack into it. Because in today's computer age, model trains can have computer chips. The other issue I will leave to the creator of all my problems. All right, my turn. All right, so future me has explained to you size of trains. I want to talk about the other key word you need to understand about model training that you will get thrown around to you by most model trained people, and that's the word era. Era. Obviously, if you understand English, you know what an era is. It's a time frame. Many, if not most, model trained people pick a time period they're trying to recreate. What draws them to a particular time period is on them. Family history, or just history in general. Maybe they're just something from their childhood. They're in their 60s or 70s now and they remember riding trains in England or Germany or France, the golden age of some kind, or some other historical relevance that makes them want to recreate that time period. But anyhow, so here we go. The eras are not etched in stone. Every company, every model railway magazine, the years can vary. But they are generally divided into 6 eras. Era 1 is basically any time from the beginning of trains all the way through the industrial age up until World War I, sometime around 1918, 1920, up until World War I. Era 2 is basically after World War I to the end of World War II. Era 3, in some people's mind, is that golden age of railway, both passenger railway in the United States and railway in general in United Kingdom and Europe. The 1940s up until around 1970. Why do they draw the lines here? Usually it was some technological change, or for example, at the beginning of the 70s, things began to be digitized at the stations, the way trains were run and controlled, the methods had changed. In the United States, this is the era passenger trains truly died. We stopped riding trains once we built the interstate highways in the 1950s. Yes, I know on the East Coast we have trains. I know we have Amtrak, but it is such a small percentage of Americans who use these. A much smaller percentage than, say, the 1930s, the 1940s, and up to the building of the superhighways in the 1950s. All right, so, and Era 3, that's the post-war era, is probably the most popular era, based on what I've seen over the internet over the last 3 years, the hundreds and hundreds of channels and model train shows I've gone to and so forth. That is the most popular, especially here in America, but even watching on European YouTube channels. Really, eras 3 and a bit into era 4, which is from the 1970s into the 80s. About the 1980s, we have the computerization of everything. And that's era 4 into somewhere in the mid-80s, from the end of the golden age into the 80s. Era 5 is basically the mid-80s and those technological changes up until the year 2000, just the millennium. Why we draw the line there? Well, again, we start to have more advanced computer programming, digitalization of everything. The new, sleeker aerodynamics, the green things coming in a bit more. And then anything after 2000, the most modern, which is my era, is Era 6. Why am I into Era 6? Because that's what I was exposed to. Those are the trains I rode. I don't know about the great steam age. I don't really know about the other eras.
I know about them historically and so forth, but it's just not my fantasy or exposure to it. My exposure is the modern, high-speed, very well-run modern train systems in Europe, especially Germany and Central Europe. And just how great are they? Well, you can go to Germany and people will complain if the train is 5 minutes late. Only 5 minutes late, and they're like, "The train is late." And yes, they can be later. Things happen, accidents, whatever. But those are the eras. You pick a time frame, because that will set everything else up you do, from building your layout, if you're going to build a layout. And you don't have to even build a layout. You don't want to worry about all that, then buy whatever trains you think are pretty. Build a big circle or a funky layout, whatever you want, and just run your trains. If you want to create a timepiece or a time period, do that. Because in the end, even with whatever I'm trying to offer, it's have fun. Enjoy it. So that's the history lesson. Back to Mr. Now. So, there you have it. A little bit about size and scale, and a little bit about era. Two very important concepts you really need to think about if you're going to get into model trains. While neither is drastically important, thinking about them and maybe forcing yourself into a specific size and a specific era will save you a lot of money down the road, because there are less expensive ways to do model trains, and any hobby is expensive. I don't care if you play video games. You're going to put a lot of money into it. Model trains are no different. And one way to avoid a money pit is to really think about what size you want to model, and is there a particular time and place you want to model. So anyhow, this was episode 2. I'm Anthony Dodge, and I'll see you back for episode 3. See you later.
You're asking for trouble. That is what I like.